"Who was that man?" he asked. The question hung in the room, heavy and sharp. Dorsey Holmes didn't ask questions twice. He ran his empire with cold precision, and Natalie was the secretary who knew all his secrets. But looking at the security footage, her throat closed. The man on the screen was the one ghost she thought was dead. If she told Dorsey the truth, he'd kill him. If she lied, Dorsey would kill her. Rain lashed against the floor-to-ceiling windows of Dorsey Holmes's corner office. It was a miserable Tuesday in November. Inside, the climate control hummed a steady 70 degrees, smelling faintly of ozone, expensive espresso, and the sharp tang of Dorsey's aftershave. Natalie Page stood beside his mahogany desk, a stack of heavily redacted manifests held against her chest. She had worked for Dorsey for 4 years. In that time, she had learned the exact cadence of his breathing, the meaning behind the slight narrowing of his dark eyes, and the precise moment when a business negotiation turned into a death sentence. Dorsey wasn't a man prone to outbursts. He was a creature of glacial calm. Right now, he was staring at the flat-screen monitor mounted on the far wall. The screen displayed grainy black and white security footage from their shipping warehouse in the South Ward. "Play it again," Dorsey instructed. His voice was quiet. It barely carried over the drumming of the rain, but in this office, his whispers were absolute law. Natalie tapped the spacebar on the wireless keyboard. The video looped. A man in a heavy canvas jacket slipped through the side door of the warehouse. It was 3:14 a.m. The intruder moved with a distinct irregularity, a slight drag of his left heel. He didn't look at the cameras. He didn't hesitate. He knew exactly where the blind spots were, weaving between the towering crates of undocumented pharmaceuticals with practiced ease. Within 40 seconds, he was gone. And so was a lockbox containing $300,000 in untraceable cash. Dorsey leaned back in his leather chair. He steepled his fingers beneath his chin. He didn't look angry. He looked intensely curious, which was infinitely worse. He bypassed the biometric scanner on the side door without triggering the failsafe, Dorsey mused. He knew the patrol route of the night guards, and he walked straight to a box that only 3 people in this organization know about. Natalie's lungs felt suddenly small. She watched the screen. She watched the drag of that left heel. A motorcycle accident on Route 9. A shattered tibia that never set quite right. "Who was that man?" Dorsey asked. He turned his head slowly, locking his gaze onto her. His eyes were the color of wet slate. Natalie opened her mouth. Nothing came out. The air in the room felt entirely depleted of oxygen. She stared at the frozen frame on the screen, the pixelated silhouette of the intruder, paused just beneath a harsh halogen bulb. It was just a shadow, a blur of motion, but she knew the slope of those shoulders. She knew the way he carried his hands in his pockets. It was Thorin, but Thorin was dead. He had burned in a totaled sedan on a desolate stretch of highway 5 years ago. Natalie had paid for his funeral. She had stood in the freezing rain while an empty casket was lowered into the ground, burying the man who had ruined her life, stolen her youth, and left her with a mountain of debt that led her directly to the Holmes family's doorstep. "Natalie," Dorsey's voice dropped a fraction of an octave. It was a warning. Her fingers tightened around the manifests. The edges of the thick paper bit into her palms. She had survived in Dorsey's world by being infallible. She was the woman who never flinched when men walked into the office with bruised knuckles and split lips. She scheduled bribes like dentist appointments. She was Dorsey's anchor, the one clean, hyper-competent fixture in a life built on violence. Natalie started. Her voice cracked. She swallowed hard, forcing the panic down into a tight, hard knot in her stomach. I don't know. The lie tasted like copper. Dorsey didn't blink. He just watched her. The silence in the office stretched, pulling taut like piano wire. He cataloged every micro-expression on her face. The sudden pallor of her skin, the shallow rise and fall of her chest, the white-knuckle grip she had on the folders. He knew her too well. 4 years of working side by side, sharing late-night takeout over ledgers of extortion, understanding each other in a deeply unspoken, dangerous way. He knew she was lying. You don't know, Dorsey repeated softly. It wasn't a question. No, Mr. Holmes, the footage is too degraded. We can run it through the enhancement software downstairs, but... Don't bother, Dorsey interrupted. He stood up. He was a tall man, impeccably dressed in a charcoal suit that hid the bulk of his shoulders. He walked around the desk, his footsteps completely silent on the thick carpet. He stopped inches from her. Natalie kept her chin level. She refused to step back. If she showed weakness now, she was dead. Dorsey reached out. His large, warm hand wrapped gently around the stack of files she was clutching. He pulled them from her rigid grip and tossed them carelessly onto the desk. Then he looked down at her. You've never lied to me, Natalie. I'm not, she whispered. Dorsey reached up and brushed a stray lock of dark hair behind her ear. The touch was unnervingly tender. It made her skin crawl with terror. Everyone lies, he said, his thumb lingering against her jawline for a fraction of a second before he pulled away. But I expect you to be better at it. He turned his back to her, walking toward the window to watch the rain. Take the rest of the afternoon off. Go home. Rest. Sir, the end-of-month accounts. I said go home, Natalie. The finality in his tone shut down any argument. We will discuss this tomorrow, when your memory improves. The elevator ride down to the lobby took 32 seconds. Natalie counted every single one of them. By the time the stainless steel door slid open, her hands were shaking so violently she had to shove them deep into the pockets of her wool coat. She walked past the security desk, nodding sharply to the guard, and pushed through the revolving doors into the gray afternoon. The cold rain hit her face, grounding her. Thorin was alive. The realization sat in her chest like a stone. She hurried down the busy sidewalk, ignoring the puddles soaking through her leather boots. Thorin Reed, the charismatic, reckless grifter who had promised her the world when she was 22 and naive enough to believe him. He had borrowed money from dangerous people. He had gambled it away. And when the walls closed in, he faked his own death, leaving Natalie to face the collectors. Dorsey's father had been the one holding the markers. When they came to break her legs, Dorsey had intervened. He saw something in her, a cold, desperate resilience. He offered her a job to pay off Thorin's debt. She had traded her freedom for her life, slowly transforming into the untouchable, indispensable machine that Dorsey relied on. She hailed a cab, sliding into the vinyl back seat. South Ward, she told the driver, corner of 8th and Elm. As the cab merged into the sluggish city traffic, Natalie pulled out her phone. She opened a secure messaging app, her thumbs flying across the screen. She needed to know how the hell Thorin had bypassed a biometric lock. Dorsey's touch still burned on her jaw. He knew. Dorsey always knew. The fact that he hadn't immediately locked her in the basement of the warehouse meant he was playing a game. He was giving her enough rope to hang herself. He wanted to see where she would go, who she would contact. Natalie glanced casually out the rear window. A black sedan was 3 cars back. It had been there since she left the building. Dorsey's men. She gritted her teeth. Think. You know how Dorsey operates. If Dorsey wanted Thorin dead, Thorin would be dead already. The missing $300,000 was a nuisance, not a crisis. What mattered to Dorsey was the breach of security. What mattered to Dorsey was loyalty. Natalie's loyalty. The cab pulled up to the curb on 8th and Elm. It was a dilapidated neighborhood, all crumbling brick and neon signs buzzing with failing electricity. Natalie paid the driver in cash and stepped out. She didn't look back at the black sedan. She walked purposefully into a narrow alleyway, flanked by overflowing dumpsters. She knew Thorin. If he was back in the city, he wouldn't be staying in a hotel. He would be in the warren of abandoned tenement buildings that honeycombed this block. It was where they had first met, back when they were broke and scraping by. The rain plastered her hair to her cheeks. She found the rusted fire escape of a boarded-up building and hauled herself up. Her knee scraped against the jagged metal, tearing her stockings, but she didn't stop. She climbed to the 3rd floor, jimmied a loose window pane just like she used to do a decade ago, and slipped inside. The apartment smelled of damp rot, stale cigarette smoke, and something distinctly metallic. "Hello, Natalie." She froze. The voice came from the shadows in the corner of the room. Natalie reached into her coat pocket, her fingers wrapping around the cold grip of the compact Smith & Wesson she carried everywhere. She drew it seamlessly, aiming at the dark corner. A heavy sigh echoed in the empty room. The glow of a match flared, illuminating a hollowed-out face. Thorin looked terrible. He had aged 20 years in 5. His blonde hair was thinning, his skin gray and deeply lined. He lit a cheap cigarette, shaking the match out. "You always were quick on the draw," he rasped, coughing wetly into his fist. "You're supposed to be dead," Natalie said. Her voice was terrifyingly steady. There was no affection left in her. The girl who had loved him had died a long time ago, buried under ledgers of blood money and the heavy, suffocating weight of Dorsey Holmes's protection. "I had to be," Thorin said, stepping slightly into the ambient light, filtering through the dirty window. He leaned heavily on a cane. "If I didn't disappear, the old man would have killed us both." "He just held a gun to my head instead," Natalie corrected coldly. "I paid your debt, Thorin, every single cent, with interest. I sold my soul to balance your books." "I know, and I'm sorry." He didn't sound sorry. He sounded desperate. "I didn't come back to hurt you, Natalie. I came back because I'm dying." Natalie didn't lower the gun. "You stole 300 grand from Dorsey Holmes last night. You walked into his warehouse. How did you get past the biometrics?" Thorin chuckled, a dry, rattling sound. "I still have friends in low places. An old contact works in Holmes's tech division. Slipped me a ghost key. I needed the money, Natalie. I need treatment. Experimental stuff down in Mexico. It's my only shot." "You shouldn't have come back. Dorsey has your face on camera." "Grainy footage. A ghost. That's all I am." "He asked me who you were today." Thorin went still. The cherry of his cigarette burned bright red. "What did you tell him?" "Nothing yet. Natalie." Thorin took a step forward. "You can't tell him. You know what he is. He's a monster. He'll butcher me." "He's the monster who kept me alive when you ran away like a coward," she snapped, stepping back, keeping the distance between them. "You love him." The words hit her like a physical blow. The absolute absurdity of it. Love wasn't a word that existed in Dorsey's world. There was possession, there was loyalty, there was control. "Shut up," she hissed. "I see it in your eyes," Thorin said, a bitter smile twisting his lips. "The Ice Queen of the Holmes family. You've let him inside your head. Does he know, Natalie? Does he know that his perfect, loyal secretary used to run scams with the dead man he's hunting?" Before she could answer, the floorboards outside the apartment door groaned. Heavy footsteps. Natalie's heart slammed against her ribs. She hadn't shaken the tail. The door didn't burst open. It was pushed open slowly, the rusted hinges shrieking in protest. Dorsey stood in the doorway. He had lost the suit jacket and the tie. His white dress shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, the sleeves rolled up to his forearms, revealing the dark, intricate ink that wrapped around his skin. In his right hand, he held a suppressed automatic pistol, pointed casually at the floor. Behind him, in the darkened hallway, Natalie could see the massive silhouette of Carmine, his lead enforcer. Dorsey stepped into the room. He looked at the squalor, looked at Thorin, and then finally rested his gaze on Natalie. The gun in her hand was still pointed at Thorin. "I told you to go home, Natalie," Dorsey said softly. "Dorsey, I can explain," Natalie started, but her voice faltered. "Can you?" Dorsey walked further into the room, his shoes crunching on broken glass. He stopped a few feet away from her. He didn't look angry. He looked profoundly disappointed. "I sat in my office for an hour after you left. I watched the GPS tracker on your phone move across the city. I watched you walk into this ruin." He finally turned his attention to Thorin. Thorin was trembling, his cigarette forgotten, burning down to his fingers. "Thorin Reed," Dorsey said. The name sounded vile in his mouth. "My father told me you burned in a ditch." Thorin stammered, shrinking back against the peeling wallpaper. "You owe my family a great deal," Dorsey continued, his voice conversational. "My father forgave your debt because he believed you paid with your life. But you didn't. Instead, you left this woman, who loved you, to take the bullet for your mistakes." Dorsey looked back at Natalie. His eyes were unreadable. "And yet, here she is, standing in a condemned building, pointing a gun at you, but positioning her body between you and the door, protecting you." Natalie realized with a sickening jolt that he was right. Her stance was defensive. Subconsciously, she was shielding Thorin from the entrance. She immediately lowered her gun and stepped aside. "I'm not protecting him." Dorsey's lip curled in a fraction of a smile. It was cold. "Good." He raised his weapon, leveling it squarely at Thorin's chest. "Wait!" Natalie yelled, stepping forward and grabbing Dorsey's forearm. The silence in the room instantly fractured. Carmine took a heavy step into the doorway, his hand going to his holster. Dorsey raised his left hand, signaling Carmine to stop. He didn't pull away from Natalie's grip, but he didn't lower the gun either. He looked down at her hand, wrapped tightly around his wrist, and then up to her face. "Give me one reason, Natalie. One reason why I shouldn't paint this wall with his brains. Because he has a contact in your tech division, Natalie said, her words tumbling out rapidly. That's how he bypassed the lock. He used a ghost key. If you kill him now, we won't know who the mole is. Your entire security infrastructure is compromised. Dorsey stared at her. The seconds ticked by. The rain drummed relentlessly against the broken window pane. Slowly, Dorsey lowered the gun. He didn't put it away. "Carmine," Dorsey said, not breaking eye contact with Natalie. "Yeah, boss. Take Mr. Reed to the basement at the docks. See to his medical needs. Keep him comfortable. And ask him, very politely, for a name." Carmine stepped into the room, crossing the floor in 3 massive strides. Thorin didn't fight. He looked at Natalie one last time, a pathetic, hollow look, before Carmine grabbed him by the scruff of his coat and dragged him out into the hall. The door closed with a heavy thud, leaving Dorsey and Natalie alone in the shadows. Natalie let go of Dorsey's arm. She stepped back, suddenly hyper-aware of the proximity between them. The scent of ozone and aftershave cut through the rot of the room. Dorsey holstered his weapon at the small of his back. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a clean, monogrammed handkerchief. He stepped toward her, invading her space, and reached out. Natalie flinched, expecting a strike. Instead, Dorsey gently wiped a streak of dirt and grease from her cheekbone. "You lied to me," he said, quietly. "I was going to handle it. I was going to get the money back. You thought you could manage a ghost. You thought you could protect your past from your present." Dorsey's thumb replaced the handkerchief, tracing the line of her jaw again, just like he had in the office. This time, the touch felt heavy with a dark, terrifying gravity. "He's nothing to me," she breathed. "He better not be," Dorsey murmured, leaning in slightly, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper against her ear. "Because I own your present, Natalie, and I own your future. Every breath you take in this city belongs to me. Do you understand?" Natalie swallowed hard. The cynical, professional armor she wore every day was completely shattered. She was stripped down to the bone, standing before a man who could ruin her with a single word. But looking into his eyes, she saw the dangerous truth Thorin had spit at her. It wasn't just control, it was an obsession. "I understand," she whispered. Dorsey pulled back. The intensity vanished, replaced by his usual, impenetrable mask of business. "Good. Now, come back to the office. We have end-of-month accounts to finish." He turned and walked out the door, leaving her to follow him back into the dark. The absurdity of their world lay in the transitions. 1 hour ago, Natalie was standing in a condemned building, smelling of rot and copper, aiming a loaded weapon at a ghost. Now, she was sitting at her polished glass desk on the 42nd floor, keying offshore routing numbers into a secured spreadsheet. Dorsey sat across the room at his own desk. He had put his suit jacket back on. The gun was hidden again. He was reading a quarterly risk assessment report, as if the confrontation in the South Ward had been nothing more than a minor traffic delay. The silence in the office was suffocating. The rain had stopped, leaving behind a heavy, oppressive fog that pressed against the floor-to-ceiling windows, swallowing the city lights. Natalie's fingers flew across the mechanical keyboard. The rhythmic clatter was the only sound in the room. She was working strictly on muscle memory. Her mind was a fractured looping reel of Thorin's hollowed-out face and the terrifying electric heat of Dorsey's thumb against her jaw. "He's dying." Thorin's words rattled in her skull. She pressed the delete key, erasing a typo. She didn't care if Thorin died. That was the most horrifying realization of the evening. The girl who had wept over a closed casket 5 years ago was entirely gone. In her place sat a woman who was annoyed that Thorin's resurrection was messing up her ledger. Dorsey's desk phone buzzed, a single, sharp electronic chirp. He didn't put down his pen. He pressed the speaker button with his left index finger. "Yes, it's a name," Carmine's voice grated through the speaker. It sounded breathless, laced with a dark, physical exertion that made Natalie's stomach turn over. "David Hayes, mid-level systems architect in the East Wing. He's the one who coded the ghost key." Dorsey's expression didn't change. "Did Mr. Reed require much persuasion?" "Nah," Carmine grunted. "Folded after the first fracture. Guy's paper thin, boss, crying about some clinic in Tijuana. Keep him there. Give him water. Nothing else." Dorsey hit the button, severing the connection. He finally looked up, his slate-gray eyes locking onto Natalie across the expanse of the room. David Hayes. Natalie didn't hesitate. She opened a new tab on her monitor, bypassing the standard HR firewall with a backdoor code she had written herself. She typed the name. 32 years old, she recited, her voice a flat, professional monotone. "Employed here for 3 years, unmarried, no kids. He has a gambling problem. Bookies in the North End have been squeezing him for the last 6 months. Thorin must have found out and offered him a cut of the 300,000 to pay them off. Print it." Natalie hit the command. The laser printer in the corner hummed to life, spitting out a single sheet of paper. She stood, smoothed her skirt, and walked over to the machine. She carried the paper to Dorsey's desk and set it down precisely in the center of his blotter. Dorsey looked at the paper, then up at her. He didn't say a word. He just stared. It was a test. Everything with Dorsey was a calculation. He was waiting to see if she would break, if she would ask for mercy for Thorin, or if she would collapse under the weight of the violence happening in his name. Natalie held his gaze. She kept her hands clasped loosely in front of her. She refused to tremble. "Call Mr. Hayes," Dorsey instructed softly. "Tell him there is a critical discrepancy in the server logs. Tell him he needs to come up to my office immediately to patch it." "It's 9:30 at night," Natalie pointed out. "If he knows the money was taken, he'll know why he's being called up. He might run." "If he was smart enough to run, he wouldn't have sold a ghost key to a dead man," Dorsey replied. "Make the call." Natalie walked back to her desk. She picked up the receiver and dialed the IT department's nightline. Hayes answered on the 4th ring. His voice was entirely too loud, a brittle, frantic energy bleeding through the receiver. "David, it's Natalie Page, Mr. Holmes's office." A sharp intake of breath. Hi, Natalie. Kind of late, isn't it?" "We have a localized failure in the biometric encryption on the South Ward mainframe," she said, her tone perfectly even, projecting the mild annoyance of an administrator dealing with a glitch. "Mr. Holmes is still here. He's unhappy. Get up here and fix it. I can remote in from my desk." "You can't. The firewall tripped an analog lockdown. Physical override required from this terminal." It was a complete lie. Natalie didn't even know if an analog lockdown existed. "Right, okay. I'm on my way." She hung up. She looked at Dorsey. "He bought it. He's coming up." Dorsey leaned back in his chair. "You lie beautifully, Natalie, when it suits you." The barb hit its mark. Natalie flushed, the heat creeping up her neck, but she didn't look away. I do what is required to maintain the efficiency of this office. Is that what you call it? Dorsey stood up. He walked slowly around the desk, closing the distance between them again. He stopped just inches away. Natalie had to tilt her head back to look at him. Efficiency. Such a clean, sterile word for a woman who just served a man his own death sentence over the phone without blinking. He stole from you, Natalie said. He did, Dorsey agreed, his voice a low rumble. But you didn't do it for me. You did it to prove a point. You did it to show me that you aren't Thorin Reed's frightened little girl anymore. He reached out, his knuckles grazing the side of her neck. His skin was warm. The touch was agonizingly slow. You belong to this life now, Natalie. You belong to the dark. Before she could form a reply, the heavy oak doors of the office swung open. David Hayes looked exactly like a man who knew he was walking into a trap, but lacked the courage to turn around. He was sweating heavily. His cheap striped tie loosened at the collar. He carried a silver laptop pressed tightly to his chest, like a shield. He stopped a few feet inside the room. His eyes darted nervously between Dorsey, who was standing close to Natalie, and the sprawling, empty expanse of the office. Mr. Holmes, Hayes stammered. I brought the diagnostic tools. Dorsey didn't step away from Natalie. He simply turned his head to look at the IT architect. You won't need them, David. The problem has already been diagnosed. Hayes swallowed hard. His Adam's apple bobbed. Oh, good. Was it a server desync? No, Dorsey said, his voice dropping into that quiet, terrifying register that preceded absolute destruction. It was a parasite, a small, insignificant parasite that decided to feed on my property. The color drained entirely from Hayes' face. He took a step backward, his heel catching on the thick Persian rug. I don't know what you mean, sir. Natalie, Dorsey said, not taking his eyes off the trembling man. Explain it to him. Natalie's breath hitched. Dorsey was forcing her to hold the knife. He was making her an active participant in the execution of his power, sealing her complicity in blood and fear. She looked at Hayes. The man looked pathetic. He looked like Thorin. A cold, hard clarity washed over her. At 3:14 a.m. this morning, an unauthorized individual bypassed the biometric scanner at the South Ward warehouse, Natalie said, her voice ringing clear and authoritative in the quiet room. The intruder utilized a ghost key, a localized override code compiled specifically for that scanner. The only terminal with the clearance to generate that specific code belongs to you, David. Hayes began to shake. My terminal, it was hacked. I left it unlocked. Someone must have... Don't insult my intelligence, Dorsey interrupted softly. You owe $50,000 to the Moretti brothers in the North End. They promised to break your hands by Friday. An old grifter offered you a way out. He took $300,000. What was your cut? 10%? 20? Hayes dropped the laptop. It hit the carpet with a muted thud. He fell to his knees. Please, he begged, the word tearing out of his throat in a wet sob. Please, Mr. Holmes, they were going to kill me. They know where my mother lives. I was desperate. I'll give the money back. I haven't spent it yet. I swear to God, I'll give it all back. Dorsey walked toward him. He moved with the slow, deliberate grace of a predator stalking injured prey. He stopped in front of the kneeling man, looking down at him with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust. You brought outside liabilities into my house, Dorsey said. You let rats into my walls to save your own skin. I'm sorry. I'll do anything. I'll work for free. Please. Natalie watched from the desk. Her heart was beating a slow, heavy rhythm against her ribs. She felt no pity. She only felt a profound, chilling detachment. This was the cost of weakness in Dorsey's world. You either adapted and became iron, or you were crushed. Dorsey looked over his shoulder at Natalie. What do you think, Natalie? Does he deserve a second chance? The question hung in the air, heavy with consequence. Dorsey was giving her the power of life and death. He was testing the depth of her transformation. Natalie looked at David Hayes. The man was weeping openly, staring at her with wide, terrified eyes, begging a secretary for his life. She thought of Thorin, whining in the dark, using her as a shield. She thought of the 4 years she had spent meticulously building her armor, protecting herself from the chaos of men who couldn't control their own vices. No, Natalie said quietly. The word felt heavy, dropping like a stone into a still pond. He's a liability. Liabilities are eradicated. Hayes let out a choked wail, burying his face in his hands. Dorsey's eyes flared with something dark and triumphant. A slow, approving smile touched the corners of his mouth. It was a terrifying expression. He turned back to Hayes. You hear that, David? The management has spoken. Dorsey reached into his pocket and pulled out his cell phone. He pressed a single button on speed dial. Bring the freight elevator up. We have garbage to take out. He ended the call and slipped the phone back into his pocket. He didn't touch Hayes. He didn't draw his gun. He simply stood there, an immovable force of nature, as the heavy rumble of the industrial elevator echoed through the wall behind them. The brass doors at the far end of the office slid open. Carmine stood inside, his massive arms crossed over his chest. His knuckles were raw and split, stained with dried blood that Natalie knew belonged to Thorin. Get up, Dorsey ordered. Hayes couldn't stand. His legs wouldn't support him. He remained on his knees, weeping hysterically. Carmine let out a heavy sigh, stepped out of the elevator, and crossed the room. He grabbed Hayes by the back of his collar, hauling him up effortlessly, as if the man were made of rags. My mother, Hayes sobbed as Carmine dragged him backward. Please, my mother. I'll send her flowers, Dorsey said flatly. Carmine threw Hayes into the elevator and pressed the button for the basement. The doors slid shut, cutting off the sound of the weeping instantly. The silence rushed back into the room, ringing in Natalie's ears. Dorsey stood still for a long moment. Then he turned and walked back to Natalie. He didn't stop at the required professional distance. He stepped right up to her, invading her space completely. The smell of ozone, aftershave, and a faint metallic tang of adrenaline surrounded him. He reached out and took her hands in his. His grip was firm, anchoring her. You did well, he murmured, his voice a low caress. Natalie looked down at their joined hands. Her fingers were cold, his were burning. She had just condemned a man to death, or at the very least, a brutal disappearance. She had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. She looked up, meeting his slate-gray eyes. What happens to Thorin now? Dorsey's thumb stroked the back of her hand, a steady, hypnotic rhythm. Thorin is a ghost, Natalie, and we don't let ghosts haunt this house. Put your coat on, Dorsey instructed, his voice slicing through the heavy silence of the office. He dropped her hands, leaving her skin feeling instantly chilled by the ambient air of the room. Natalie didn't ask questions. She walked to the brass coat rack in the corner, pulled her wool trench over her shoulders, and buttoned it up. She felt numb. Her mind was a perfectly compartmentalized series of locked boxes. In one box was David Hayes, weeping on his knees. In another was Thorin, chained somewhere in the dark. She refused to open either box. Right now, she was just an employee following a directive. Dorsey led the way to his private elevator. The descent to the private garage was soundless. The doors slid open to reveal a cavernous concrete expanse illuminated by harsh fluorescent tubes. A black SUV sat idling near the exit, its exhaust pluming in the damp subterranean chill. They climbed into the back seat. The interior smelled of expensive leather and gun oil. Dorsey tapped the partition glass twice, and the driver put the vehicle in gear. They drove through the city without speaking. Natalie stared out the tinted window. The fog had rolled in thicker off the harbor, turning the street lamps into hazy, glowing orbs. The city outside looked hostile and completely indifferent to the violence that happened in its shadows. She watched pedestrians hurrying along the wet sidewalks, collars pulled up against the cold. They lived in an entirely different reality. They worried about overdue rent and office politics. They didn't know that just a few blocks away, men were erased from existence for making a bad bet. She caught Dorsey's reflection in the glass. He was watching her. He didn't offer empty reassurances. He didn't ask if she was okay. In his world, okay was a luxury nobody could afford. You were either functioning or you were a liability. "The docks," Natalie murmured, reading the street signs as they turned onto a desolate industrial stretch. "We need to close the ledger," Dorsey replied simply. The SUV navigated a maze of towering shipping containers, rusted cranes, and chain-link fences topped with razor wire. The smell of the ocean was strong here, a bitter mixture of salt, rotting kelp, and heavy diesel fuel. They pulled up to a corrugated metal warehouse that looked completely abandoned from the outside. Carmine was waiting by a heavy steel side door. He nodded to Dorsey and pulled the door open, stepping aside to let them pass. Inside, the warehouse was a cavern of shadows, echoing with the low, continuous thrum of industrial generators. Dorsey walked with purpose, navigating the labyrinth of wooden crates until they reached a set of concrete stairs leading down beneath the floor level. "Stay close," Dorsey said, glancing back at her as he began his descent. Natalie followed. The air grew significantly colder with every step, biting through the thin fabric of her slacks. The basement was a relic of an older, much more brutal era of the city's port. The walls were weeping with moisture, stained with decades of grime and things she preferred not to identify. A single, bare incandescent bulb hung from a frayed wire in the center of the main holding room, casting a harsh, jaundiced pool of light on the concrete floor. Thorin was sitting in a metal folding chair in the center of that light. He was bound at the wrists and ankles with heavy zip ties. Carmine hadn't lied. Thorin had folded quickly, but the enforcer had clearly made a point before asking his questions. Thorin's canvas jacket was stripped away. His cheap shirt was torn, clinging to him with dark, wet patches. His left eye was swollen entirely shut, the surrounding tissue a mottled canvas of purple and black. He was shivering violently. Natalie stopped at the edge of the light. She stared at the man she had once intended to marry. 5 years ago, she would have thrown herself at Dorsey's feet, begging for Thorin's life. She would have offered anything. Her money, her freedom, her own life, to stop him from hurting. Now she just felt a profound, exhausting emptiness. Thorin lifted his head. His remaining good eye squinted against the glare of the bulb. When he saw Natalie standing next to Dorsey, a desperate, feral glimmer sparked in his pupil. "Natalie," he croaked. His voice was a dry, scraping sound, like sandpaper against concrete. He tried to lean forward, but the zip ties held him fast. "Natalie, thank God, tell him who I am. Tell him we were going to be together." Dorsey didn't move. He stood beside Natalie, an immovable monolith of dark wool and lethal intent. He didn't draw a weapon. He didn't have to. His mere presence sucked the oxygen out of the room. He was waiting. He was giving her the floor. "He already knows who you are, Thorin," Natalie said. Her voice echoed off the damp walls. It sounded utterly foreign to her, flat, cold, and stripped of any residual affection. "He knows you're the man who stole $300,000 from his vault." "I did it for us," Thorin yelled, a hysterical edge creeping into his tone. Blood bubbled at the corner of his split lip. "I was going to get the treatment. I was going to get healthy, and then I was going to come back for you. We could have gone away, just like we planned. Paris, the coast, anywhere but here. You died in a car fire on Route 9, Thorin." Natalie stepped forward, leaving Dorsey's side. She walked into the pool of light, her heels clicking sharply against the concrete. She stopped 2 feet away from him. "I paid for the casket. I paid the funeral director. And then I paid the men you owed money to. Men who came to my apartment with crowbars and gasoline." Thorin flinched. He looked down at the floor. "I didn't have a choice. They were going to kill me. So you decided to let them kill me instead." "No, I knew you'd figure it out. You were always the smart one, Natalie. You always knew how to survive." The sheer audacity of the statement hit her like a physical blow. It wasn't an apology. It was a justification. He hadn't left her because he was trying to protect her. He had left her because he knew she would take the hit and keep standing. He had weaponized her competence against her. "You're right," Natalie said quietly, looking down at his bruised, pathetic face. "I do know how to survive, but you don't." Thorin's head snapped up. Genuine terror finally broke through the layers of his grifter's charm. He pulled against the thick plastic binding his wrists to the chair frame, the chair legs scraping harshly against the floor. "Natalie, please," he begged, the words tumbling out in a rush of panic. "Don't do this. Don't let him do this. You're not like them. You're a good person. You're sweet, and you're kind, and the person you are describing hasn't existed in 5 years." Natalie cut him off smoothly. She turned her head slightly, looking back at Dorsey. He was watching her intently, his hands resting casually in his pockets. The expression on his face was one of dark, quiet fascination. He wasn't rushing her. He was letting her dismantle her own ghosts piece by piece. "Do you know what I do for Mr. Holmes?" Natalie asked, turning her attention back to Thorin. "I sanitize his ledgers. I schedule the bribes that keep the police chiefs looking the other way. I organize the logistics for shipments that destroy entire neighborhoods. I just sent a terrified IT technician to an unmarked grave because he sold you a code." Thorin stared at her, his good eye wide and horrified. You're lying. You're just trying to impress him." "I don't need to impress him," Natalie stated. It was the truest thing she had said all day. Her relationship with Dorsey wasn't built on performative cruelty. It was built on a brutal, shared understanding of reality. Dorsey saved my life when you abandoned it. He didn't ask me for love. He didn't feed me empty promises about Paris. He gave me a desk, a salary, and a set of rules. I follow the rules and I survive. You broke the rules, Thorin. I'm sick, Natalie, Thorin screamed, saliva flying from his mouth. I have tumors in my lungs. I'm dying anyway. Just let me walk out of here. Keep the money. I don't care. Just let me die in a bed and not on a concrete floor. Natalie felt a microscopic twinge in her chest. A ghost of a ghost. She remembered him laughing in a cramped kitchen, tossing cheap pasta into a boiling pot. She remembered the way he used to look at her before the gambling, before the debt, before the lies became his oxygen. She closed her eyes for a fraction of a second. She took a deep breath of the freezing damp air. When she opened her eyes, the memories were gone, locked away permanently in the dark. You should have stayed dead, she whispered. She took a step backward, retreating out of the harsh yellow light and back toward the shadows where Dorsey stood. Thorin realized in that moment that he had lost. The frantic energy rained out of him, leaving behind a hollow, ruined shell of a man. He slumped against the metal back of the chair, his chin dropping to his chest. He began to weep silently, his shoulders shaking with the force of his sobs. Natalie walked back to Dorsey. She didn't look back at Thorin. She stopped next to her boss, standing shoulder to shoulder with him in the dark. Are you finished? Dorsey asked softly. Yes, Natalie replied. Her voice was steady. The trembling in her hands had completely stopped. Dorsey looked at her, his slate-gray eyes searching her face for any sign of hesitation, any crack in her armor. He found none. The transformation was complete. The secretary had finally become a soldier. He raised his hand and snapped his fingers once. The sound cracked like a gunshot in the cavernous basement. Heavy footsteps echoed from the top of the stairs. Carmine descended, carrying a thick canvas tarp and a heavy iron chain. He didn't look at Natalie or Dorsey. He walked straight past them, his eyes fixed dead ahead on the man in the chair. Come, Dorsey said. He placed a hand lightly on the small of Natalie's back, guiding her toward the stairs. His touch was no longer terrifying. It was grounding. It was a physical tether to the world she had explicitly chosen. They walked up the concrete steps. Behind them, Thorin began to scream, a raw, tearing sound of absolute despair. Natalie didn't flinch. She didn't break her stride. She kept her eyes focused on the heavy steel door at the top of the landing. They stepped out of the basement, and Dorsey pulled the door shut behind them. The heavy iron lock clicked into place with a definitive, ringing thud, cutting off the screams instantly. The silence in the upper warehouse was absolute. Natalie stood still for a moment, letting her eyes adjust to the gloom. She felt lighter. The suffocating weight of the past 5 years, the guilt, the anger, the unresolved grief, was gone, buried behind that steel door. Dorsey turned to face her. He reached up, taking her face in both of his large hands. His palms were warm against her freezing skin. He tilted her chin up, forcing her to look directly into his eyes. There are no more ghosts, Natalie, he said, his voice dropping to a low, possessive rumble. There is only this. There is only us. Natalie looked up at him. She saw the ruthlessness in his gaze, the unyielding demand for absolute loyalty, and the dark, dangerous obsession that tied him to her. She wasn't a captive anymore. She was a willing participant in the empire he had built. "I know," she whispered, leaning slightly into his touch. Dorsey's thumb swept across her cheekbone, a mirror of the gesture he had made in the squalor of Thorin's apartment, but this time there was no threat behind it. It was an acknowledgement, a dark coronation. He leaned down, pressing his lips to her forehead in a brief, burning kiss. It wasn't an act of romance, it was a brand. "Let's go home," Dorsey said, releasing her and stepping back. Natalie nodded. She pulled her wool coat tighter against the chill and followed him out of the warehouse, leaving the ghosts behind in the dark, where they belonged. The ride back to the city center was devoid of conversation. The silence inside the SUV wasn't the suffocating, tense quiet of the afternoon. It was the exhausted, hollow stillness that follows a demolition. Natalie watched the rain begin to fall again, streaking the heavily tinted glass. The city blurred into a smear of neon and brake lights. She had crossed a threshold, stepping over the corpse of her old life to permanently inhabit Dorsey's world. The realization should have terrified her. Instead, it felt like an immense, heavy coat had finally been lifted from her shoulders. She was no longer a victim of her past. She had become the architect of it. The SUV bypassed the corporate headquarters entirely, slipping into the subterranean garage of a high-rise residential tower in the Diamond District. Dorsey owned the top 3 floors. It was a fortress of reinforced steel, ballistic glass, and silent security details. They rode the private elevator up in tandem. Dorsey unbuttoned his suit jacket, rolling his shoulders to work out a knot of tension. He looked tired. The flawless, predatory composure he wore in the office had fractured slightly, revealing the sheer physical toll of managing an empire built on violence. The elevator doors opened directly into the penthouse. The space was massive, minimalist, and aggressively cold. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramtic view of the skyline, but the interior was devoid of anything personal. No photographs. No art that wasn't chosen by an investment consultant. It was a place designed to observe the world, not to live in it. Natalie stood near the entryway, unsure of her footing. She had managed Dorsey's schedule, his money, and his lies for 4 years, but she had never been inside his home. "Take off your coat, Natalie," Dorsey said, walking toward a sprawling matte black wet bar. "You look like you're bracing for an interrogation." She slipped the heavy wool trench off her shoulders, draping it over the back of a stark leather armchair. She walked further into the room, her heels clicking softly against the polished hardwood. Dorsey poured 2 fingers of amber liquid into a heavy crystal glass. He poured a second, walked across the room, and pressed it into her hand. Their fingers brushed. The contrast between the freezing crystal and the heat of his skin sent a sharp, electric jolt up her arm. "Drink," he ordered softly. She lifted the glass and took a swallow. The scotch burned a harsh, fiery path down her throat, settling into a heavy warmth in her stomach. It grounded her. Dorsey took a slow sip of his own drink, watching her over the rim of the glass. He leaned against the edge of a massive granite kitchen island, crossing his ankles. "If you had asked me to spare him," Dorsey started, his voice a low, rough rasp in the quiet room. "If you had begged for his life or tried to negotiate his debt, I would have killed you both." The words were delivered without malice. It was simply a statement of fact. Natalie looked down at her drink. I know. You were a liability today, Natalie. For the first time in 4 years, you let a personal variable interfere with the mechanics of my business. You lied to my face. You walked into a compromised location without backup. You endangered the operational security of this entire organization. He pushed off the counter, slowly closing the distance between them. He stopped when he was close enough that she could smell the scotch on his breath, mingling with the ever-present ozone and aftershave. And yet, Dorsey murmured, reaching out to trace the rim of her glass with his index finger. When the fracture happened, you didn't break. You hardened. You looked a man in the eye and sent him to the dark to protect what is ours. Ours. The word hung between them, heavy and absolute. He wasn't talking about the company. He wasn't talking about the money. He was talking about the structure of their shared reality. Natalie tilted her head back, meeting his gaze. The slate gray of his eyes was no longer cold. It was burning with a dark, possessive intensity that made her breath catch in her throat. I didn't do it to prove a point, Dorsey, she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. I did it because Thorin was a disease, and you are the cure. Dorsey's hand moved from her glass to her waist, his fingers gripping the curve of her hip with bruising force. He pulled her flush against him. The sudden impact knocked the air from her lungs. He took the crystal glass from her trembling hand, set it blindly on the nearest table, and caged her against the heavy glass of the window behind her. I am not a cure, he growled, his face inches from hers. I am a contagion, Natalie. I ruin everything I touch. I told you that from the beginning. Then ruin me, she breathed. Dorsey's control snapped. He kissed her. It wasn't a gentle exploration. It was a collision. It was bruising, demanding, and tasted of expensive scotch and raw, unadulterated power. His hands tangled in her hair, pulling her head back to deepen the kiss, his body pressing her into the cold glass of the window. Natalie didn't pull away. She kissed him back with equal ferocity, her hand sliding up the broad expanse of his chest, gripping the lapels of his shirt. All the fear, the adrenaline, the exhaustion of the day poured into the space between them. He broke the kiss, resting his forehead against hers, his breathing heavy and ragged. There is no going back from this, Dorsey warned, his thumbs sweeping fiercely across her cheekbones. You don't get to wake up tomorrow and pretend you are just my secretary. You don't get to look away from the blood anymore. I stopped looking away a long time ago, she replied, her voice steady, anchoring him. Dorsey pulled her tightly against his chest, burying his face in the curve of her neck. He held her as if she were the only solid object in a world that was constantly collapsing around him. In the reflection of the dark glass, Natalie saw the city stretching out below them, a vast, glittering grid of millions of lives. They were entirely disconnected from it now. They existed in an atmosphere of their own design, built on violence, sustained by trust, and sealed in the dark. Morning arrived with brutal indifference. The fog had burned off, leaving behind a sky of painfully sharp, cloudless blue. Natalie sat at her desk on the 42nd floor. The hum of the climate control was identical to yesterday. The smell of expensive espresso lingered in the air. To an outside observer, absolutely nothing had changed. But the tectonic plates of her reality had shifted permanently. She looked at her computer monitor. There was a new name on the internal HR roster for the East Wing Tech Division. David Hayes had been scrubbed from the system entirely. His employee ID, his payroll records, his parking pass, all deleted. In his place was a junior analyst, promoted quietly overnight. The machine of the Holmes family simply recalibrated and kept grinding forward, crushing whatever was caught in the gears. Natalie felt no guilt. She felt a profound, chilling competence. Dorsey walked out of his private office. He was wearing a dark navy suit today, his tie perfectly knotted, his demeanor completely reset to the glacial calm that terrified his competitors. He carried a heavy leather-bound ledger, the physical master file of his offshore accounts. He didn't walk to his desk. He walked directly to hers. He dropped the heavy book onto the glass surface. The sound echoed sharply in the quiet room. "The routing numbers for the Cayman trusts," Dorsey said, his tone strictly professional. They need to be randomized and re-encrypted by noon." Natalie looked at the book, then up at him. She knew what this was. This ledger had never left Dorsey's physical possession. It was the absolute core of his empire. Holding this book was the equivalent of holding the gun to the head of the entire organization. "You're giving me the master cipher?" she asked, keeping her voice neutral. "I'm giving you the keys, Natalie," Dorsey replied. He rested his hands on the edge of her desk, leaning down slightly so his face was level with hers. The professional mask slipped just a fraction, revealing the possessive heat from the night before. A king does not hide his gold from his queen. Natalie's breath hitched. She looked at the heavy leather cover, tracing the faint scratches on the surface. 4 years ago, she had walked into this building as a terrified, desperate girl, looking for a way to survive a debt she didn't owe. She had built a fortress of competence, hiding behind calendars and redacted manifests, pretending that if she just worked hard enough, the darkness wouldn't touch her. But the darkness hadn't touched her. It had welcomed her. She placed her hand flat on the ledger, pulling it toward her. She met Dorsey's slate-gray eyes, refusing to blink, refusing to flinch. "The encryption will be finished by 11:30, she stated calmly. A slow, terrifying smile spread across Dorsey's face. It was the smile of a predator who had finally found an equal in the cage. He reached out, his knuckles brushing lightly against the collar of her silk blouse, a proprietary touch that sent a shiver down her spine. "I know it will," he murmured. He stood up straight, turning his back to her and walking toward the floor-to-ceiling windows to look out over his city. Natalie opened the ledger. The pages were dense with numbers, blood money, and secrets that could destroy thousands of lives. She picked up her pen. Thorin was dead. The ghosts were gone. There was only the ledger, the power, and the man standing by the window who had given her the world by burning her old one to the ground. She began to write, "If you made it to the end of this dark, twisted journey, thank you for watching." Natalie's transformation from a trapped secretary to a ruthless queen of the underworld proves that sometimes the only way to survive the monsters is to become one. Do you think Natalie made the right choice embracing Dorsey's world, or did she lose her soul in the process? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to hit that like button, share this video with your fellow Mafia romance fans, and subscribe to the channel for more deeply emotional, gritty storytelling. Stay tuned.